everybody, Dr. K here, and welcome back to the second joint pain relief video. Today, we're going to talk about the good old RICE formula. That's right, rest, ice, compression, and elevation. This is simple stuff when it comes to joint pain relief, but a lot of people get it wrong. And I think the reason for it is everybody gets caught up in what's fancy and what's supposed to solve the trick or do the trick immediately, and they forget what's most important. Remember, it's not about resting your entire body. You know, that's old school. It's about resting the injury. Ice could not be more important. When it comes to resting an injury, you may as well go ahead and elevate it. You see how we're putting these all together? Add some ice by placing a wet paper towel over the injury and a thin bag of ice directly over that. You're going to want to ice at the beginning of every day and the end of every night. And the reason for this is, well, your joints imbibe or fill with fluid when you're sleeping, and when there's already too much swelling in your shoulder joint or in your elbow, and you go to bed, all that fluid rushes in, there's no space for it, causes all kinds of compression, and naturally leads to pain. So after a day full of wear and tear and being up and about and using it too much and causing some pain by accident, but being on the go and having all this adrenaline, no wonder it's already swollen, fluid rushes in, it's too darn swollen. You want to put the ice on. It doesn't get rid of the swelling, it stops it right where it is. When you wake up in the morning after all this fluid's trying to get into the joint, ice it again before you get moving and cause re-injury because of all the compression that's there. Now, compression. Rest, ice, compression, elevation. Well, compression's really good for like putting an ACE wrap around you or something when you're feeling like you really need to limit range of motion. However, you might be wondering how to do that in the shoulder, because a lot of people get it when it comes to their ankle or when it comes to their knee. When it comes to your shoulder, you actually have to wrap all the way around the other side of your back in order to effectively compress the shoulder. So it goes around under the armpit, all the way around through your chest and back around again. Don't worry if you don't know how to do it. You can always ask for help. You can't go that wrong if the idea is to maybe compress the ice onto your shoulder and let it sit and be able to walk around. However, you don't have to wrap your shoulder every time you have an injury. If it's your elbow or a joint that's a little easier to get to, like your wrist, yeah, please go ahead and wrap it, at least for a day or two. Let that area get a little bit of rest. You know, move it around in a controlled way, but not when you're at work, not when you're playing with the kids or doing something abnormal, but when you're dedicating time for exercise. And then finally, elevation. I don't know why I never see anybody do this. Get your freaking foot above the level of your heart. Get your hand above the level of your heart when you're icing. You don't have to do it all day long. Just make sure it gets above the level of your heart. Let that fluid drain down, pump back through your venous system to your heart, and allow reuptake to happen so that when that oxygenated blood makes it back to your muscles, they actually get a good contraction, good nutrition, and they can heal faster. It just works better this way. So again, today the theme is joint pain relief, the RICE formula. It doesn't get any simpler than this. Rest, ice, compression, elevation. But until you start doing this, you can't expect your pain to go away. It's very important, so get on it, okay? Again, I'm Dr. K from VideoFitnessBlog.com, and it's my goal to help you lose fat, strengthen joints, and become that body and that person that you've always deserved to be. Have a great day.